Today we will be covering the fighting and major battles of World War I. This lecture corresponds to section 7.2 in your textbook. World War I was called the Great War during its time, as it was the largest conflict in world history up until that point. And obviously, in 1914, there was no way to know that World War II was coming. The fighting quickly becomes a stalemate on the Western Front, as the Germans keep trying to fight their way through Belgium to carry out the Schlieffen Plan. They encounter far more Belgian resistance than they had expected. Germany's plan to quickly defeat France fails. Russia was also able to mobilize their forces far faster than Germany had predicted. Remember, the whole point of the Schlieffen Plan was to quickly knock out France before Russia could muster their forces to prevent a two-front war. Russia wins some very early battles against the Germans because the German forces are split between Belgium and the Eastern Front. German generals quickly call for troops to move to the Eastern Front to confront the Russian threat, which then weakens their forces in Belgium. In September 1914, British and French forces push back the Germans at the Marne River near Paris. The Battle of the Marne is a critical event at the start of World War I, as it showed that the Germans' hopes for a quick victory on the Western Front would not be realized. The Battle of the Marne ends in an Allied victory over Germany and leads to a stalemate on the Western Front, as troops begin to dig into trenches where they will stay for almost 4 years. The Western Front in France and Belgium turns into thousands of miles of trenches, stretching from the Swiss frontier to the English Channel. An underground network of bunkers and trenches were built by both the Allies and the Central Powers. The space between the opposing trenches was called no man's land. This was an empty area filled with barbed wire and dead bodies. The idea of no man's land was that anyone who went over the top, meaning they came out of their trench, would be quickly gunned down by the enemy's side. Most battles on the Western Front were fought to overrun enemy trench lines and force a physical battle between the sides. Sadly, huge casualties resulted from trench warfare, and the result was usually only gaining a few hundred yards of territory. The saying was, "You could smell the front before you saw the front," because of all the dead bodies that had to be left out in no man's land. Here is the line of trenches on the Western Front. The green lines are the German trenches, purple are for the French, pink are British or Belgian, and the yellow lines show the movement of the Western Front line. This is a diagram of a trench line on the Western Front. You can see men trying to run into no man's land, only to be stopped by barbed wire and machine gun fire from the opposing trench line, as well as aircraft. At the back of the trenches, you can see the heavy long-range artillery that would fire at both troops and trenches in hopes of collapsing them. These are pictures of trenches on the Western Front in World War I. Note the small and cramped space that soldiers would sit in for months at a time. Trenches were dug into the wettest region of Europe, Flanders. These damp conditions caused chronic health problems for soldiers such as trench foot. Trench foot is a medical condition caused when feet have prolonged exposure to damp and cold conditions. If the condition is left to continue untreated, it will result in skin tissue dying and falling off the foot, often resulting in gangrene infections that led to foot and leg amputations or even blood poisoning. It is estimated that trench foot killed some 75,000 British soldiers and 2,000 Americans, and those are just some of the losses on the Allied side only. Other problems included rats eating supplies and biting soldiers. Bugs and pests such as lice were rampant, spreading among the troops. Due to the poor conditions and tight quarters, disease was another major problem, as it would quickly strike a whole trench. There are several major battles in World War I that you will need to know. Most of these battles, as previously stated, were waged in the hopes of breaking the stalemate on the Western Front and getting troops out of their trenches. The Battle of Verdun was fought from February to December 1916 and was the longest battle of World War I. It was also one of the largest battles on the Western Front. Verdun began by German troops launching attacks on the French, trying to overwhelm their stronghold at Verdun and bring an end to the war. The Germans had planned for a battle of attrition, or inflicting mass casualties on the French to wear them down to the point of surrender. It is estimated that at Verdun there were over 700,000 casualties, which breaks down to 300,000 soldiers killed. Verdun ends with a hard-won French and Allied victory over Germany. A red zone was declared after the war around the battlefield at Verdun. Even to this day, many gas canisters and unexploded artillery are found. The French government estimates that with the current funding levels, it will take the French government another 700 years to completely clear the area of weapons and make it safe to live in again. Here is a drawing indicating the places where the Battle of Verdun was fought. See Verdun in the middle of the map. Here are photographs from the Battle of Verdun. The French alone fired 10 million rounds of field artillery, over 1 million medium caliber rounds, and 600,000 large rounds during the course of the battle. In just the first hour of battle, the Germans launched over 1 million artillery shells at French lines, using 808 artillery guns. You can see the empty shells piling up in the photo at the top right. The map in the top right corner shows the designated zones in the north and east of France. Blue indicates an area without damage. Green is an area with slight damage. Yellow indicates significant damage. And red are areas of complete devastation from World War I, or, quote, red zones. The bottom pictures are modern recent photographs of World War I bombs and artillery still being dug up by French authorities. Again, the government estimates it will take 700 years to fully clear these red zones. Every few years, sadly, farmers are killed plowing their fields in these areas when their tractors hit unexploded ordnances from World War I. Another major battle of World War I was the Battle of the Somme from July to November 1916. This was the largest battle of the Western Front, and it was initiated by French and British forces. The goal was to hasten victory for the Allies by breaking through German trench lines near the Somme River in France. British and French troops continually shelled German trenches for a week straight, firing a combined 1 million mortar shells at the Germans. Unfortunately, many of the mortars never detonated, and most of the German trenches were left intact. So when British troops went over the top, meaning left their trenches, to begin a direct frontal assault on the German trench line massacred the British troops. The first day of the Battle of the Somme is the single bloodiest day in all of British military history. Over 60,000 casualties, 20,000 of those were deaths, most within the first hour of fighting. Like Verdun, the Somme became a battle of attrition, with each side trying to wear down their opponent. At the Somme, the British introduced the tank for the first time in warfare. In the end, there was no clear victor, and hardly any territory changed. For very little gain, there was tremendous loss. The Germans suffered 650,000 casualties, the French 195,000, and the British 420,000 casualties. This is one of the hallmarks of World War I. Huge loss, excessive casualties for very little territory gain. Here are maps indicating where the Battle of the Somme was fought. These are images from the Battle of the Somme. Artillery shells from the Somme. World War I saw the first use of poison gas and chemical weapons in warfare. The Germans were the first to employ poison gas on a large scale in 1915. Chlorine gas was one of the first used. It was not a very effective killing agent, as it created a large, visible green cloud and was water-soluble, so a simple rag soaked in water would prevent inhalation. Also, if the weather was wet, it would disperse the gas cloud. Chlorine gas was more effective as part of psychological warfare, where the men in the trenches would see the poison barreling towards them across no man's land. The French were the first to use phosgene gas in 1915, which was more deadly and dangerous than chlorine, due to the fact that it is colorless and almost odorless, making it hard to detect. Phosgene was a more potent killer and accounted for 85% of poison gas deaths in World War I. Lastly, mustard gas is probably the most notorious chemical weapon used in the war. Mustard gas was also introduced by the Germans in 1917. Mustard gas is not a particularly effective killing agent, but can cause tremendous distress and pain to those exposed. Mustard gas causes terrible skin irritation like lesions and blisters. If inhaled, it can scar the lungs and burn the inside tissues of your throat, making it difficult to breathe. In severe exposure cases, it can take weeks to die, as the person agonizes with blisters all over their bodies and scarred lungs. Countries employ poison gas as a way to try to force men out of the trenches and speed up the war. Here are pictures of gas victims and attacks. The man in the upper left and the colored arm image are from mustard gas attacks. The top right is chlorine gas, as you can see it rolling across the battlefield. Notable instances of poison gas use during the war occurred at the Second Battle of Ypres and at Passchendaele. The Second Battle of Ypres was fought from April 22nd to May 25th, 1915. It saw the first mass use of poison gas deployed by the Germans, causing 350 British deaths and over 7,000 British injuries. In the end, the Second Battle of Ypres was an Allied victory at the cost of over 100,000 total casualties. The Battle of Passchendaele is also a notable battle from July 1917. This was the first battle in which the Germans used mustard gas. The goal of the Battle of Passchendaele was for the Allies to try and break through to the coast in Belgium, to be able to destroy where German submarines were kept. In the end, there were over 700,000 casualties at Passchendaele, with only a few miles gained by the British and Canadian forces. The British were the first to introduce tanks in 1916. Tanks were designed to be able to move across no man's land. The first tanks were very unreliable and often broke down or got stuck in mud. The first airplanes used in combat were also introduced in World War I, along with the first aircraft carrier naval vessels. Submarines or German U-boats were a new invention in World War I, and it was the last major world conflict to use horses. We have been talking today almost exclusively about the Western Front across France and Belgium, but you have to remember that this was a two-front war, and the Eastern Front was also engaged in battle. Germany and Austria-Hungary battled Russia on the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front used more traditional battle tactics and did not employ widespread trench warfare like the Western Front did. Casualty rates were also much higher on the eastern side. After initial gains and victories in early August 1914, at the start of the war, Russia began to face mounting losses. At the Battle of Tannenberg, at the end of August 1914, Russia suffered a major defeat at the hands of the Germans, losing their entire Second Army and almost 170,000 casualties. As a result of Tannenberg, the Russians began to retreat from the Eastern Front, and the front line moves to Russia instead of on the German border. At the outbreak of World War I, Russia was the least industrialized of the great power nations, and they were poorly situated to fight a modern war. Russia lacked infrastructure like railroads to move supplies and troops, which left their soldiers at the front poorly equipped to the point that some soldiers did not even have rifles to shoot with. The Russian army was huge but poorly trained. The bulk of their fighters were peasants with very little formal training. Russia also relied heavily on outdated Cossack or horseback soldiers, which were not much of a match for new modern weaponry. In southern Europe, Bulgaria had joined the Central Powers in 1915 and was trying to defeat its old rival Serbia. Italy ends up joining in the war as well in 1915 and declared war on both Austria and Germany. Italy had made a secret alliance with the Allies, stating that the Allies would give Italy some Austrian land on their northern border if they helped fight for the Allies. In October 1917, Italy suffered a major defeat by the Austrians and relied on British and French forces for the remainder of the war to protect their country. Romania will end up joining the Allies in 1916 in an endeavor to gain back lands taken by Austria. However, they are quickly crushed by the Central Powers. Even though most of the fighting took place in Europe, World War I was a global conflict. In 1914, Japan joined the Allies by declaring war on Germany. Japan wanted to take German territory in China. The Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers in 1914. This was a huge blow for the Allies since the Ottomans could cut off trade and supply lines in the Black Sea to Russia. To counter Ottoman power, the British sent Colonel T.E. Lawrence to Arabia to inspire a massive Arab revolt against the Ottomans. This resulted in the Ottomans losing territory and having to focus on their own empire instead of on World War I. Here is a photograph of T.E. Lawrence, the orchestrator of Arab rebellion against the Ottoman Empire. The striped green area on the map shows the areas of Arab revolt. The Russians and Ottomans fought on another front in the Caucasus Mountains. This area was home to ethnic Armenians who were Christian, making them a minority in the Muslim Ottoman Empire. In 1915, the Ottoman government embarked on a brutal campaign against the Armenians due to the fact that some had joined the Russian cause, and the Ottomans erroneously attributed this to their shared Christian faith of the Armenians and Russians. Through barbaric forced marches, treatment, and starvation, the Ottomans killed between 600,000 and 1.5 million ethnic Armenians. Because of imperialism, European colonies were also drawn into the war. The Allies overran German colonies, and the British especially used their foreign colonial troops in battle from places like Canada, Australia, India, and New Zealand.